Well, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here once again in Lethbridge with this very particular and demanding audience. I've got my timelines here, so I will try to stick with them. I want to tell you today, or really talk today, about a story I started working on back in 2004. And a story that has taken on a life of its own in a very extraordinary way, and that also involves a very extraordinary woman whose fight for justice in this province should be an inspiration to all of us. So, let's begin by, this story is a story about a new technology that is constantly changing and its impact on rural communities. And at the base, it's also a story about how our resources are becoming more difficult to extract. And so we started at the top of the pyramid with pools of gas and pools of oil in this province that were relatively easy to pump out of the ground. Now we're going after stuff that is much more difficult, much more extreme, whether it's shallow coal fields in central Alberta, or whether it's oil shale in the Cardium, or oil shale along the Blood Reserve in the border with Montana. So we're not talking about this because business as usual has ended, and we now have to resort to more extreme measures to extract these resources. And then we forget to talk about existing problems. We have some existing problems with the oil patch. In particular, we have drilled more than 4.3 million wells. Each one of those wells on the continent serves as a pathway for gas migration. We know that the cementing of these wells in many cases has been poor. We know that the cement corrodes over time. Just think of a piece of bubble gum underneath a desk as it grows old and becomes more brittle, and that you've got a good picture of what a cement on a well site looks like. And so we have this huge existing liability of wells across the landscape that are leaking gas. This gas goes into the atmosphere, or it follows the path of least resistance in the ground and ends up in groundwater. And this is a map of actively leaking wells throughout the province, put together by Carlos Mullenbachs. That's, of course, what cement and bubblegum, but cement over time will just corrode just like a piece of bubblegum. So we've got more than 500,000 well bores in this province. Almost all of them are leaking to one degree or another, some of them prolifically, and they are, as Maurice Dussault, one of the country's foremost petroleum geologists, would say, a threat to the environment and public safety. So we're not doing a good job of attending to this infrastructure that's out there. And then we introduce a technology that is shaking everything up. That's what hydraulic fracturing does. It creates mini earthquakes in the ground to break up rock formations to release the oil or methane that might be there in very small amounts over extensive distances, to the point that this is an industry that's creating earthquakes all the time. Several were created around Del Bonita in 2012 when you had earthquakes of, I think, 2.4, 2.5 being set off by frack operations. Frack operations in Fox Creek, of course, have set off earthquakes as great as 4.6, 4.8 in northern BC. Once you hit 5, you are actively damaging buildings and structures and roadways. So we have this new technology, we have existing liabilities, with the consequence that here, as a former member of the regulator here in Alberta puts it, Teresa Watson, we've got skeletons coming out of the closet, and the skeletons being leaking methane gases and other hydrocarbons from oil and gas wells across the province. So how did fracking begin? It began, nearly 120 years ago, believe it or not. It began in Pennsylvania, home of the first great oil rush on the continent. And it began at installations that looked like this. And these were very shallow oil wells, and they might be pumping 10, 20 barrels of oil a day, and as soon as they started to decline, everyone would scratch their head and say, what's wrong with this well? We need to perhaps open more fractures in the rock. How do we do that? A Union colonel by the name of Colonel Roberts came up with the idea, well, let's blow the hell out of it. He got a torpedo, and he created this incredible business, Roberts Torpedoes, that took over the whole fracking business and a great grievance, actually, because they were picking up the body parts of the torpedo men all over the forests of Pennsylvania for years afterwards, especially when they switched from black powder to nitroglycerin. Now, nitro was used as a frac. This is what Colonel Roberts' torpedo looked like. And Charlie Stallnaker, many of you might even have heard of this name. I mean, he was a torpedo man. He was a nitro guy, and used to drive around southern Alberta and Montana, fracking vertical wells at that time, and the occasional rattlesnake den. And he had a red truck with a big sign on the back saying, nitro, and so he didn't have to worry about people tailgating him. He trained with 15 men, and Charlie was the only one that died of old age. So anyway, so that was the fracking business. Then it evolved and started to change, and they started to experiment with acids, and then eventually with fluids, and injecting fluids at high pressure to break rock. And the first fluids were napalm and diesel fuel and gasoline. And this is what an early frack job looked like. So 10,000 gallons, maybe 600,000 horsepower on the scene. And then, the engineers thought, well, geez, why don't we use nuclear bombs and see if that should really frack the rock? And of course it did. And they tried this in Colorado, in a number of places. The only problem was that there was no market for the radioactive gas that it did produce. And so they shut down that idea. And so here we are today with a modern frack job where we are marshaling enormous amounts of brute force. And the whole history of the technology is all about the evolution of brute force. And where you have, 61,000 horsepower on site, and you're pumping 5 million gallons of water, maybe combined with the petroleum distillate to make it more viscous and slide down that wellbore easier, and hundreds and hundreds of pounds of sand. So fracking in the 1950s kind of looked like a canoe, and today it's more like a nuclear submarine in terms of the energy and force that it employs, hence the problems with earthquakes, hence the problems with rattling other oil and pipeline infrastructure and making this existing problem of gas migration much more worse. So if you go back and you look at the science, which I did when I was writing this book because I was curious about a whole bunch of things. And so this was a study that came out in 1990, and this was a study documenting some of the very first earthquakes being caused by hydraulic fracturing per se in Oklahoma, where in 1978, mega frac is done on a deep shale gas well, triggering 70 earthquakes in 6.2 hours alone. The industry has changed the seismicity of Oklahoma. This was the result of a 5.6 earthquake. This earthquake was triggered by another form of fluid injection. You have a lot of wastewater produced from hydraulic fracturing. In this case, this is the pumping of wastewater into the ground at high volumes over long periods of time, the water eventually hitting a fault, destabilizing a fault, and changing the seismicity of Oklahoma so that Oklahoma now looks like California. Northern BC, the earthquake patterns there have entirely been changed as well by the hydraulic fracturing industry. And big issue here is public safety. When are we going to get a really big frac job that brings down a lot of homes, destroys a bridge, a dam, pipelines, or something like that? So, and petroleum engineers have known about this for years. Seismic activity can create faults and fractures, and that's what fracking does. And seismic vibrations can increase permeability and upward gas migration. So again, you have a technology that is exacerbating existing problems in the industry. And, and lots of evidence that the gas is getting into groundwater. Here's evidence from 1987 put together by the Environmental Protection Agency. And a very simple declaration here. During the fracturing process, fractures can be produced, allowing migration of native brine, fracturing fluid, and hydrocarbons from the oil or gas well to a nearby water well. When this happens, the water well can be permanently damaged, and a new well must be drilled or an alternative source of drinking water found. And this was a case in West Virginia. Now, there has never been a regulator in this province that could admit to this very fact, yet. Maybe the book will change this. All right, so where did they start fracking first in North America? Well, all over the place, but one of the big areas they hit first were shallow coal basins throughout the United States in the 1980s when the United States was running out of oil and gas, and they thought, okay, how do we make sure we have our energy security here? Let's frack the heck out of these coal basins and see what happens. Well, when you're fracking a coal basin, coal is one of the most fractured substances in the world, and coal mining was almost an early form of hydraulic fracturing in the sense that you'd go down vertically and then you'd go across horizontally, and you'd have your walls of the mine being constructed by the miners with picks and axes, and you'd be chipping away at this coal and releasing methane, and you'd have these enormous gas methane explosions, making coal mining, of course, a very hazardous proposition. And that's exactly what the hydraulic fracturing did, but on a different scale. And so here's the San Juan Basin, which kind of looks in southern New Mexico and northern Colorado, southern Colorado and northern New Mexico, and a very rich coal basin. The industry fracked the hell out of it in the 1980s. And as a result, they changed the rate at which gas was migrating from you can see, from the coal beds that were at the surface. So you had methane coming up in the Animas River. You had methane coming up into people's homes, blowing up people's homes, blowing up trailer homes, blowing up water pumps, and as a consequence, to this day, industry has triggered something they can't really control. There is now a cloud of methane over the four corners, almost coming exclusively from this field, from both leaks and from fractures. It is the largest, what NASA calls the largest methane anomaly in North America. The big fracking companies, the service companies that do all the fracking, and you've got to think, fracking is now one of the most expensive services taking place at an oil well. It's not cementing, it's the fracking. And so Schlumberger and Halliburton are selling their services to the oil and gas industry and saying, look, we've got just the right technology to, pull a little more out of these wells, kind of like plastic surgery for hydrocarbons. And but here they even are admitting, yep, because of the shallow depth of coal, holy smokes, you're going to be contaminating freshwater aquifers. And then that brings me to Jessica Ernst and her story. So one of the important things to know about Jessica is that she's a member of the oil and gas industry and has worked in it most of her life. She was an environmental consultant. She became highly skilled at doing cumulative impact studies, wildlife impact studies, pipeline assessments. She worked a lot with First Nations in northern BC and northern Alberta, and she worked for some of the biggest companies around. She worked for Chevron. She worked for Murphy Oil. She worked for Encana. She worked for the Great Canadian Oil Sands Company. You name it, Jessica was there, and she was there because she was highly competent and her work was highly respected. So along comes one of her largest clients, Encana, around 2003, 2004. They come up with a plan really to frack shallow coals throughout central Alberta. And at the time, they're even calling it an experiment because they're not quite sure how much force they're going to need, what kind of liquid they will have to use to break open these coals to free the methane that's stuck to these very tight coal formations, like metal, like a magnet to a piece of metal. And so they started this drilling in 2003, 2004, and landowners around Rosebud, where Jessica Ernst was living, she had a property there, still does. Everyone in the community knew that she worked for the oil and gas industry, and they said, Jess, what the heck is going on? Can you explain to us why industry needs such close well density? And what are the water demands? And what's going to happen to our groundwater? And what are our rights here as landowners? So she found herself being pulled into this whole debate by her community. And you can see why. I mean, there's what ended up being drilled in a space of 10 years, more than 10,000 wells between Edmonton and Calgary, in the area of the province which has the largest density of water wells in Alberta. Not to mention thousands and thousands of existing oil and gas well bores, many of which are leaking, and then you do all this fracking, and you're going to release gas, and that gas is going to come up in unpredictable places. In Jessica's case, it came up in her own water well, and also in the water wells of many people living in the Rosebud Valley. And her water, and it was a heavy oil geologist who was visiting her house one day, said, Jess, you know, the water glasses were on the table. Just imagine your water at this table, and it was fizzing away like 7-Up. Never done that before. All of the original tests on her water well said, you know, gas present? No. And he said, Jess, you've either got CO2 in your water or methane. You need to have it checked immediately. And sure enough, she did, and she found that she had explosive levels of methane, and not just methane, but other hydrocarbons in her water well. So here you can see where the E is, that's where Jessica lives, and then you can see the red dots are all of the shallow drilling that took place into coal seams, and then all of the other red dots are existing oil and gas wells. So you can see that the collision taking place underground with enormous amounts of brute force being applied and methane being released. And the kicker for Jessica Ernst was one day a water well driller by the name of Chris Gerritsen said, Jess, you know, I've got a report that you might want to see that's on a water well just down the valley. It might explain some of the issues that you've seen. And so she went over to Chris Gerritsen's house, and sure enough, here was a report on the Kenny well. And if you look at this very carefully, in green, you see the Encana well going straight down. You can see the two water wells in the river bottom. So the well is drilled in the uplands, and they begin to frack at the same stratigraphic level as the water wells are drawing water from coal. And so Encana fracked right into the aquifer. And the Kenny well was full of nitrogen, and they were doing a nitrogen frack. The well in question, it was 70 million liters at 24 different intervals. That's the amount of frack fluid going down there. At depths to 125 meters, all right, you know, the so-called baseline of groundwater protection, it starts at 200 meters. Okay, from 125 to 400 meters, you know, this well was gushing water, 8,000 liters of water a day. And Encana plugged it. It was no good. So, what do we know from industry? What are petroleum engineers saying about this? Well, it can happen. In fact, it happens all the time. It's been happening since the beginning of fracking. A well can be fracked several times during its lifetime, and in some instances, however, hydraulic fracturing can harm a well by fracking into water. Well, why is that? Because you can never always control the fracks. There is no computer model on this planet that can tell you where all of your fractures will go and what they might connect to, or what other weaknesses in the ground they might aggravate. The hydrology-induced fractures extend vertically into a water reservoir that floods the well with water. So here, you know, here's one of the well-known petroleum engineers in a well-known textbook explaining, whoa, accidents happen, and they happen on a regular basis. And so then I went through the literature, and then I began to see that if you go through the literature of petroleum science, which is quite fascinating, here you find case after case after case. So here's a case in Pennsylvania by a petroleum geologist by the name of Samuel Harrison. And again, the same kind of scenario. Drilling in the uplands, contamination, methane contamination in the lowland bottoms, because they have fracked at the same stratigraphic level. And this is a beautiful illustration of actually of what happened in Rosebud as well. And here's just, he's showing those lines that look like bones, those are the natural fractures that the well site has connected to. And it is those natural fractures which explain why some wells can end up being contaminated with methane and others remain uncontaminated. So here's Jessica Ernst, and I must say it's a great pleasure. She is here today, and she's going to share the questions and answers with me today. And Jessica said, you know, this is not right. You cannot come into community and frack an aquifer and then pretend nothing has happened and walk away from this. And she said, not only that, you've broken Alberta law, and the law says you cannot divert water without a permit. And in this case, in Canada, had fracked into an aquifer and was diverting 8,000 liters a day. And then, if you do that, then you must resolve any allegation of wrongdoing. And that law was on the books. It's now been taken off the books. It's called deregulation. And this is the basis, really, for Jessica's lawsuit. And the reason she is so unique, there are thousands of cases like this throughout North America. There's more than 200 cases alone in Pennsylvania where the regulator has admitted that industry has contaminated groundwater with methane and other hydrocarbons. But in most cases, industry will come to the landowner and say, offer them a check and a confidentiality agreement that says, all right, this never happened, you shut up, you go away, here's your money, and that allows us to go on and frack somebody else, and it leaves the regulator off the books because they can pretend that there is no problem. And what is extraordinary, this is the same legal tactic that the Catholic Church adopted in Boston to cover up the tracks of pedophile priests. Exactly the same mechanism. All right? Children are abused. The bishop knows about the abuse. In this case, it would be the Alberta regulator. Calls the lawyers. The lawyers visit the family. Here's your money. Here's the agreement. This is kept off the public record. The priest is sent to another parish. In Alberta's case, you know, the drilling rig is sent to another county. So with Jessica, we have extraordinary, thank you, extraordinary amount of methane in her water. Now, industry will tell you, oh, geez, you know, it's perfectly natural to find methane in groundwater throughout Alberta. We are, after all, you know, on top of this sedimentary basin where all this oil and gas exists. And there is some truth to that, but not a lot of truth. I mean, it takes a long time for methane to migrate from these formations to the surface. And the one area in the province, and Jessica Ernst has actually looked at this quite extensively, where you do find some methane leaching of this nature is probably right down here around the Milk River. Elsewhere in the province, these formations are really tight. They're hanging on to their hydrocarbons. And so, yes, you can find methane in some areas in groundwater, but in very small amounts. And that's what the literature shows consistently, like it's 0.5 milligrams. It's not 30 or 60 milligrams. And when you've got 30 or 60 milligrams of methane in your water, it's almost a sure sign of industrial contamination coming from an industry source. Now, at the same time that Jessica was putting this all together and coming to terms with this as a member of industry, she had to resign from Encana. She sent them a letter saying, look, for the life of me, I cannot understand why you are behaving the way you are behaving in my community and not coming up and being honest with people about what you really want to do and the hazards and risks associated with the shallow frackings of coal. So she resigned. And then she took on this incredible legal project because when she realized that the regulators and the government weren't going to do anything. Then she got this endless flood of calls from landowners across the province. Here's Bruce Jack. This was his pump house. He and two other technicians were caught in this explosion. Bruce Jack was actually sent through the air about 70 feet. His clothes caught on fire. And this was another story of existing energy wells that were leaking methane. The methane accumulated in his pump house. The regulator was in a state of denial about this very issue, and Bruce Jack nearly got killed. There is no regulatory record of this event having taken place in Alberta, because that would spoil the illusion that water contamination does not happen here. But there was a report done by Alberta Innovates that said identified 2 gas wells with surface casing vent flows and uncemented zones. Results of a gas migration study confirmed that gas was leaking from these energy wells. Gas in Mr. Jack's water well included a component of deeper thermogenic gas, gas coming from rock in the ground that was served as a source for an energy well. Now, one of the things that really got Jess, and she constantly was searching for information, was this memo. This memo is extraordinary. This is a memo from John McDougall, who was head of the Alberta Research Council, which then became Alberta Innovates. This is a memo was written in 2007. It went to a number of ministers in Alberta, as well as ministers across the country. And the memo was saying, you know, we've got some problem with landowners, and because we fracked these coal seams in central Alberta in the Horseshoe Canyon, and you know, there's great concern about this. And here's what we're going to be doing. Alberta Environment will be responding to affected landowners based on scientific findings and evidence from the Alberta Research Council's research and expertise. Where contamination appears to be related to poor water maintenance or naturally occurring methane-producing bacteria, rather than from coal bed methane activities, landowners may not willingly accept the findings. So what he is announcing is that 8 months before the Alberta Research Council actually did its investigation, what the conclusion would be. And the conclusions were fraudulent. And they were not based on science, and they were not based on the best available scientific data. So the government covered up for Encana and said, the only problem we have in Alberta is that landowners cannot keep their wells clean, free of bacteria, and all the methane in their well water is coming from that bacteria. So Albertans were blamed for gas migration from industry sources. All right, so let me sum up then why this story is so important and why each and every Albertan needs to pay attention to it. We had a company fracking into a local aquifer. We had Alberta Environment then conduct a bogus information. And then we had the Alberta Research Council do a cover-up, which forced a citizen of this province to spend $350,000 and 8 years in counting to get the responsible authorities to account for what they allowed to happen in Rosebud, Alberta. Thank you.